Hi, I'm Matt with Sabbath Lounge, and James and Leah asked me to give kind of my testimony, my background of how I came into Torah, and appreciate them giving me the opportunity to be on Fiery Faith Ministries, and hope that you're encouraged and edified and blessed from this conversation. My faith journey really began when I was a small child. I grew up with grandparents that took me to church. I grew up with grandparents that they were the kind of people that they were there every time the doors were open. So we went twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. And I grew up in the Church of Christ denomination, and my grandparents were farmers. They worked hard, and I spent a lot of time with them. I spent the summers with them, and at different times in my growing up, my mother and I found ourselves living with my grandparents. During the summer, I would, be on the farm, and every day during lunch, there was a siesta, and my grandmother would lay down with me and read me scripture. And I vividly remember her reading from a Bible, a children's Bible that she had with pictures, which I liked. And I remember her going through the Exodus story with me. And I just remember that really standing out in my brain, and made a big impression on me. But everywhere my great grandfather went, I was with him. I tried to be I was practically under his feet all the time. And I just loved spending time with him. I didn't have a father figure. Uh, he was the first father figure that I really had. So my real dad was pretty much out of the picture by then. But eventually, we had to move away from the farm. And as we moved away from the farm, my great grandmother, she told me, she said, "Matt, now here's what you need to do." She said, "You need to pray for someone to take you to church. There'll be somebody that can take you to church." And I took her words to heart, and I did. I prayed that God would send somebody to me that could take me to church. And so I committed to that, and I stayed with that, and I continued to pray for that. And we eventually ended up moving from my great grandparents, and we lived elsewhere. And one day I'm riding the school bus, and there's this young boy that gets on the school bus, and he's got red hair, big glasses, and distinguishing features. He has a little sister with him, and no one would let them sit down on the bus. Everyone was like, "You can't sit here. We don't have enough room." So I decided to let him sit with me. Well, we began to discuss and have conversations and talk about, "Hey, you play with toy tractors? I do too." "No way." And then we talked about how we like to be on a farm. I'm like, "I love farming. I want to be a farmer." And so we had all that in common. And then it's like, "Where do you go to church?" "I go to the Church of Christ." "What? No way. That's where I go." And so, like, everything that we said, the other one was just like, "Wow, that is me. That is what I want to do." So it was, we hit it off from the very beginning. And then we're like, "All right, every day we're doing this again on the bus, same time, same place, every day we're riding together." So that afternoon, that evening, he came home and he told his mom, he's like, "Mom, I met this kid, and he would go to church with us every time the doors are open if we'd be willing to go pick him up." And it was pretty hard for her to argue with that. And she said, "Yeah, yeah, we can do that. We'll pick him up, and we can make that happen for him." So next thing you know, every time the doors are open at church, they're picking me up. They're taking me. They're driving 30, 40 minutes out of their way to pick me up and take me to church. And wherever they went to church, that's where I went to. And along that along that journey, then soon, I had a horse and a little pony where I lived, and I would ride that pony over in the afternoons, and we would play toy tractors in the dirt. And so, we became best friends quickly. And my life was kind of crazy at home, and it wasn't what I knew that it should be. So I began to pray also. The first prayer worked out pretty good. I prayed, God, send me somebody to take me to church. Boom, it happened. So now I'm like, okay, what else can we do here? So I prayed that God would send me a father. And he did. And the second father, my first father spiritually was my great grandfather, Carl Chafin. And then my second father is Alvin Mowdy. And so Alvin, I spent a lot of time with Alvin, and the young man that I'm referring to is Gabe. And so Gabe Mowdy and Alvin Mowdy, I began to spend a lot of time with them and spending time on the farm. And I was with them every chance I could get. And then, the weekend would roll around about Friday evening. I'd be like, hey, I'd call them up and go, hey, what y'all doing? Oh, y'all are hanging out watching Dukes of Hazzard. Oh yeah, that sounds like fun. And I was kind of fishing a little bit for an invite to come hang out. And I'd be like, hey mom, they're having pizza and they're watching Dukes of Hazzard and they want me to come over. Can I go over and spend the night? And of course, my mother said yes. And so that became a pretty regular occurrence. And they also began to learn a little bit more about me. And they realized that this was kind of an escape for me to get out of some of the craziness that I was in. So the Mowdy family became a home away from home for me. They eventually ended up having an extra bed for me because I was there so much. And my mother always provided for me, and she always took care of me and always made sure I had what I needed. But not all the time could she give me everything that I needed, and she knew that. And so there were times in my life when she would have to call up the Mowdys and go, hey, can Matt stay with y'all for a few months because I need to get on my feet and I need to get ahead of some bills. And so I would do that, and I would go over and hang out with the Mowdys. And but I continued to have hope that one day that God would send me a father. I kept praying for a father, even though I didn't realize at this time that Alvin was the father I had been praying for. Well, we moved around a lot, and by the time I was like 12, 13 years old, my mother was working on her third husband. And so my mother grew up going to church, and she grew up learning, she grew up with a faith and desire to do those things. But as she got older, she had kind of lost her way, lost her faith with it, and no longer attended or was interested in those things. But I continued to pray that I would have a family that went to church. I continued to pray that I had a family that loved God and that would pursue God. And so I prayed day after day. And all the while, looking back on it, I realized he gave me my grandfather Carl, and then he gave me Alvin. Well, eventually, as I got older, my mother at some point realized that she could no longer care for me. So she went to Alvin and Jill, and she told them, she said, look, I can't care for Matt the way he needs to be cared for. And she signed over custody. And so when I was in high school, I was about 15 years old. She signed over legal custody to me to the Mowdys. And, I had mixed emotions about it. I was excited that God answered my prayer and I had a godly family and a godly father. But I was a little sad, because I knew that this was different and that my relationship with my mother was going to be different from here on out. So unfortunately, it wasn't long after that she committed suicide. And the Mowdys were there for me and helped me get through that difficult time in my life. So, I basically grew up overnight and learned how to be a man, had to kind of be my own person, be my own, set my own destiny. But luckily, Yah had set me up for that and given me all the tools that I needed to be successful in life. And so I became an honorary member of the Mowdys. I became grafted in. Looking back on it, and I now realize that I was learning what it meant to be grafted in. And so if you have an experience like that, you know what being grafted in is like. And so it was such a blessing to me, and they really helped me through that difficult time. They helped get me through my formative years, helped get me to graduation. And so I graduated, and then I went on to a private Christian school. And at that private Christian school, Lubbock Christian University, I later meet my soon-to-be wife, and we start dating. And one of the first things she asked me to do, I don't even think we were dating, and she said, "Hey, will you come home with me?" My mom said I can't make the 4.5 hour drive by myself. I have to have somebody ride with me. I'm like, "Sure, I'll go with you." So I can remember to this day that I went and saw her dad's place and saw his cows and drove around and looked at everything. And I still remember walking across that living room and shaking his hand for the first time, and I knew that this was my family, that I had found family. And basically that prayer so long ago, that I asked God to send me a godly father. Well, he not only sent me one, he sent me three. He sent my grandfather, Carl, and Alvin, and now Alan, my father-in-law. So he answered that prayer in a mighty way. And so, he gave, each man taught me something different about his attributes and his love. And they taught me everything from how to control your anger to how to manage finances and how to do an old school ledger, to working on a car and how to build stuff. And so it took all of those guys, took three men to help me get to a point where I was starting to be okay. So we got married, and we were very much involved in the Church of Christ. I was a youth minister. I was a deacon. We were there every time the doors were open. My kids went to everything, did everything. We were busy people. But I continued to grow, and I continued to study, and I continued to seek out truth. And I continued to have my eyes open, and the people around me sometimes were just like, "I don't know, man, that's crazy. I don't, I don't know about that." And I was causing them lots of grief and pain. And finally, my wife and I kind of looked around one day and we're like, "Why are we doing this? We're driving them crazy. And let's get out of here. Let's do something different." So we pulled out of regular church, and I resigned from being a deacon, and we walked away from that. And I was pretty convinced I wasn't ever going to do church again, and I was like done with church. It wasn't long after that, and we began a non-denominational fellowship with some other people. We got involved in that, just like before. We soon found ourselves doing everything, setting it up, tearing it down, teaching. My wife was teaching Bible class. I was helping play in the worship band, and we doing, helping to do teaching and a website and talking to people. I mean, I did all those things. And one of the things that we wanted to do along the way was to have a community fellowship where we got together with all the churches in our area and have a fellowship at the park. And during that process, I realized that most people weren't willing to give up the butts in the seat on Sunday morning, because that means the pastor wasn't going to get paid. The bills weren't going to get paid. They couldn't keep the lights on in the church if they did that. So those churches really weren't willing to be out of the box. They said they were out of the box, but they couldn't do it. And now I understand the animal a little bit, and that's when I started realizing, hey, church is a business in a lot of ways. And that made me start thinking about it. And we went through a time of prayer and fasting, and we finally came to the conclusion, hey, all the things that we left regular church for, we just came out and we did it all over again. It was a different flavor of church, but it was still church. It was still the same thing. So we broke out of that, and we began to do just like a home fellowship. And during this home fellowship, we studied, and we were still eating unclean. And during this process, we did this with my wife's parents. And we kind of went on this journey together where we just started studying, and we went, hey, let's go back to the beginning of the book. And we started reading Genesis, and we'd come to those passages like Passover where it says, do this forever. We're like, hey, what does that mean? Do this forever. And we came across those passages to the Sabbath, and we started researching how the Sabbath was changed. We started listening to people like Rob Skiba. We started learning how, the Beast Feast came about, and our eyes really got opened. And that was easy for me. I was like, as soon as I found out, my wife was on board with getting rid of Christmas and Easter, I was like, heck yeah, I've been wanting to do this my whole life. I never liked any of this. So that was easy. And then resting on Sabbath, that was easy. Not a problem. I researched that and came to the conclusion, it makes sense that we should have always been resting on the seventh day. So, but there were still some things I struggled with, and I would argue a lot. Probably I was a little bit behind the rest of my family, a little bit behind my wife, and even my mother-in-law. And my mother-in-law would argue, her and I would argue about different things. And finally, when reading through the Torah, I read the scripture about how they were a mixed multitude. Because my big hang up was the Jew thing. I was like, I'm not a Jew. I don't want to be a Jew. I'm not trying to be a Jew. And so that was a real hang up for me. And once I researched that they were a mixed multitude when they leave Egypt, I was like, oh, this is a game changer. And then it really began to click, and I really bought into it full scale. And so I was teaching school at the time, and I had the privilege and honor of teaching my youngest son, and he was in my class, and we served breakfast in the classroom. And one day we're serving breakfast, and this kid came up to me. He's like, "Hey, Mr. Cook, I can't eat that. I can't eat that pizza." I was like, "Why can't you eat the breakfast pizza?" And he's like, "Because it's got pork on it." I was like, "Oh, tell me more. Why can't you eat pork?" And I didn't really know what he was going to say. And he's like, "Well, because we follow Torah." I was like, "Oh, wow." And I told that kid, I was like, "Guess what? I do too." And then I called my son over. I was like, "Hey, come over here. You got to meet this kid. You have to be friends with him." And so immediately, luckily, they did hit up a friendship, and they liked each other, enjoyed spending time. And pretty soon we're spending birthday parties with them, and we get to know their parents and their family. And sure enough, there are people who keep Shabbat and keep the feast and follow Torah. And they had a bunch of kids. We had a bunch of kids. I'm like, "Hey, what do you do on Saturday?" And they're like, "Nothing." And we're like, "Oh, well, let's have a Torah fellowship." And so we started in our house, and we would alternate houses and alternate cooking between the two. And just, when you put our two families together, there's like 10 of us. So there was a lot of us, and it just didn't take long. And we had some people. And over time, we've continued to do that. And so, about that time, I began a website and Sabbath Lounge, and YouTube and podcast, and most of that has begun just with a way for me to express the studies that I've been doing, and the things that I've been learning, and the things that I've questioned, and the things that I ponder. So that's kind of where all that began. And so now we have multiple families, and we trade and take turns hosting those fellowships, and we do like a potluck meal, and it works out pretty good. And so we realized for a while we just did it ourselves at our house, and it became a lot of work to prepare your house every week for a Shabbat study. And so one of the things coming out of church we realized is we didn't want a pastor, we didn't want a building, we didn't want those bills, we didn't want all of those things that come with that. We knew we didn't want a 501c. We wanted to keep it very simple, very organic, and with the ability to grow. And the way we did that is we decided, if we just were the only family that hosted, other families would not get to experience hospitality and understand how this works. And so now we have, we've had 3 to 4, maybe even a few times we had 5 different houses. Well, I think we've just mostly had 4 houses that we rotate through, but each house has an opportunity to host it and to kind of experience what that's like. And there's blessings that come with it, and there's also some work, to get your house ready. But the blessings far outweigh the trouble that it is. So it's a great blessing, and so that works really well for our group, and we're able to not have a guy. Each group is autonomous, and so if somebody wants to come into our group, the person that hosts the group, they've got to call that person and try to get to know each other and see if they want them in their house, because we feel like the people that host the fellowship, they're kind of the gatekeepers, and so that, because when you have it in your house, it's a little different than having it at a church, and so that's something different about us. But that's kind of my testimony in a nutshell, how I went from being a kid growing up in typical Christianity, going to church all the time, being a youth minister, being a deacon, to help planning a church, to walking into Torah. And by far, walking in Torah, I found it to be more, just much deeper, more meaningful. And the feast and the all of those things come to life, and you just see Yeshua all over everything. And so, just a tremendous blessing to join this. And what I love about Shabbat is every Shabbat you're joining millions of people around the world, reading the same scripture at the same time, having the same discussions, and having people go, I don't remember that, and arguing about the same things. And some of those things, sometimes you can get in the weeds a little too much, and you have to find a balance. But such a rich blessing. And also, I'm very thankful for the heritage that I have and the tradition that I grew up in. It did teach me to love the Bible, and to love God's word. And I have many brothers and sisters. Excuse me. I have many brothers and sisters in my own family that still, are doing that. And I have nothing but love and respect for them, and we get along. And so I think that's the other thing that I've learned to do is try to be careful about what I say and how I say it and when I say it, and just pray for opportunities to be able to shed some light. Because when you study the Torah like this, you do have some depth and knowledge that other people just don't have. People in traditional churches, they don't explore the Hebrew, and they don't learn the traditions, and typically, and you can open up and shed some light for people who are willing. I think you just have to look for opportunities to speak a little bit of truth here and there. But a lot of us, it's easy to become the Torah terrorist, and so I definitely don't want to be that guy. But that's the hardest part, I think, when you walk into this. You get excited, and you can't understand why everyone else can't see it, and not everyone is at the same place at the same time, and you weren't either. And so we serve a God that is very patient with us, and very, very kind, very long suffering. And so if he's patient with us, we've got patient with our brothers and sisters. But that's a little bit about Matt Cook and his journey from along the way to get to Torah. And so we do have a podcast, a YouTube channel. It's called Sabbath Lounge. If you Google Sabbath Lounge, you will find it. And I'm also in the process of writing a book. And so some of the things that I talked about in here, it is in the book Becoming Jacob. And so Becoming Jacob will become available in the fall of 2023. And I'm doing that with Deborah Publishing. And so if you have a story, if you have something that's on your heart, that you think Yah has put on your heart, contact Deborah Publishing. She may be able to help you get your words into print. So everyone's got a story, and it needs to be told. So once again, I thank Fiery Faith Ministry and James and Leah for allowing us and asking us to be a part of this and to give our testimony. And it's such a powerful thing to be a part of. And I hope that you tune in to their channel and look at all the great things and the teachings and the partial portions that they do and the people that they have on. And I just pray that they continue to have great success. And once again, I thank you for allowing us to take a part of it.